Bhagavan's entire lifetime has been a miraculous event. And it's been signed through really a series of yogic events that have never been experienced or seen in the history of humankind. His appearance here has been absolutely unique and unprecedented in spiritual history. So I want to lead you through the most important of these events to give you a feel for his entire lifetime, from his birth to this moment of his Mahasamadhi a year ago. This is the moment of his birth as a baby on his baby blanket in Franklin Square, New York, where he was born in 1939. And as you can see from this most beautiful image, this was not a mere mortal child, but an enlightened being already in samadhi. In other words, in the love blissful state of spiritual awareness. And as he described this himself in his own autobiography, he said, "As early as I can remember, I felt the presence of the divine being." And he said, "I remember only crawling around inquisitively with a boundless feeling of joy, light, and freedom. I was that divine one, a radiant form, the source of energy, love, bliss, and light, in the midst of a world that is entirely energy, love, bliss, and light. I was the power of reality, a direct enjoyment and communication of the one reality. I was the heart itself, who lightens the mind and all things. Even as a child, I recognized it and knew it, and my life was not a matter of anything else." So this was his bright knowledge as an infant and the purpose of his birth. Then, truly miraculously, at the age of 2, due to his sympathetic identification with living beings, in this case, even small puppies, he relinquished intentionally this enlightened condition. He let it go because of his love for these small puppies that he saw, and because he wanted to enter into and fully understand this mortal condition. It was the puppies, it was his parents, it was his family, everyone intimate. So he made this extraordinary gesture at age 2, showing his enlightened state. And in that gesture, he revealed that this was an avataric sacrifice. This was the sign of the avatar coming to earth to save humankind, to reveal the truth. So he then entered into this 30-year ordeal of embracing the mortal condition, in other words, sympathetically identifying with everyone, so that, as he said, he could learn humankind in order to teach humankind. And that most intense process lasted until 1970. And in the midst of that process, as his sister Joanne will be able to speak of, he often showed the sign of what appeared as ordinariness, but as she commented, he was actually always extraordinary. There was always that sign of extraordinariness. In other words, he wasn't merely mortal. He was here to do this avataric work. In 1970, in Los Angeles, he then spontaneously reawakened to his divine self nature. That was an utterly spontaneous event in the Vedanta temple. And it was a reawakening to this condition that he had been born into, of pure enlightenment, of love, bliss, joy. And this enabled him, equipped him to fully teach. Immediately, he described that when that occurred, he was filled with countless beings that replaced his meditation. He was countlessly meditating countless beings. In other words, it was a spontaneous process. And this process began a work then, at that period of time, in which he began reflecting or mirroring the pattern of egoity to beings, to awaken self-understanding of this fundamental structure of egoity that he had come to understand fully and to transcend. This, he always has described that structure as one that is transcendence of the ego as a knot, and he would always open his hand to describe the openness. That's the transcendence of that knot. And self-understanding was a means that he gave. So he was always engaged in this play. And he drew everybody to him at that time. Everybody came to him, was brought most intimately into his circumstance. And I can testify to this because I came to him, as did Ruchiradama Bharani in 1974. We came within a few months of one another. And we were immediately welcomed right into his sphere. And we had both been longing for our master for many years. Since the time I'd been a child, I was waiting for my master to appear. I had this very strong feeling of a direct relationship to the divine, but I wanted and needed my master. And then one day at Harvard University in 1970, which is actually when his reawakening occurred, I had a very strong vision of this great spiritual being. And we were together on a rooftop. And all of a sudden, everything was illuminated. First with the cosmic mandala of lights, the rainbow lights, and then that dissolved in a brilliant, illuminated white brightness that was nothing I'd ever seen with my eyes. And I knew then, I felt very certain that my master would appear soon. So I soon heard then from a friend of Adidam, Samraj, then Baba Frijan in California, and went immediately there and went to the ashram at the Mountain of Attention and went into the hall. It was very graceful then. We could go onto the sanctuary and walked into the beautiful hall there called Temple Eleutherios, and really didn't know what to expect altogether, but bowed down there, and suddenly the back door into his private meditation hall opened, and he strode in, and the winds and rains began to come up very strongly, and he sat, and then he suddenly started walking over towards me, and I immediately prostrated, which I just thoughtlessly, I'd never done that before, and he tapped me with his cane, and then took his seat again, and I felt immediately overwhelmed with his spiritual force. And then he invited me to his house with a gathering of devotees after that sitting. And again, I just prostrated on the doorstep, and he called me to where he was seated and asked my name, which I spoke. And then he just said simply, very straightforwardly, "Will you live with me forever?" And I said, "Yes." And that was that. And it was most joyful and ecstatic, and I am eternally grateful for that blessed moment and lifetime with my beloved. And you see, that was the traditional initiation of the devotee by the heart master, the guru-devotee relationship. And this is what he gave us. He gave to each person who came to him this invitation and this initiation. And for him, it is an eternal bond. He gives him, you give your life to him in devotion and service and love, and he gives himself utterly for the sake of your realization and utter love. This process of the transcendence of egoity, then, this intensive process that he entered into from the 70s for 16 years to 1986 was a very specific process in which he was in this mirroring, acting as his name said, as friend, as Baba, which means friend. And suddenly, in 1986, in January, here on Naitamba, that ended. He entered into a yogic swoon at his residence, Ashvamedhanath Bhavan here, in which that entire way of working and his very life as that person was spontaneously relinquished. It was a very dramatic event to witness, and very, very emotional to feel his overwhelming love for everyone. He was, I was actually holding him on his bed as he was rocking back and forth. As he came, it seemed he would not live. And then he began to come back into his body, to reassociate with his body, and he was rocking back and forth, but he was sobbing and tears were streaming down his face. And he was calling out, he was saying, "Oh, the billions, all the billions. I long to kiss everyone." He drew himself back, or by his own love. His love drew him back. His absolute compassion and love for all beings drew him back to here, just as his birth had. So there was this, this moment was a change, a sudden change in him. Whereas he said he descended to his toes. He said heretofore he'd only come to the heart. And now, he said, he embraced the mortal condition all the way to his feet. This was a change in the way he worked. He no longer was the friend reflecting or mirroring. Now he was the Siddha Guru. And the means of this process of relating to him was that of renunciation. So you see here, he is seated in his sign of orange sannyas robes. And he took on at this time the austerities of sannyas and began to fast, and he began to do penance in his body for the sake of everyone, to burn up the karmas of everyone. Rather than try to reflect to gain self-understanding, now he was burning up everything. And I remember a walk on the beach at Lion's Lap here, where he asked, Konchasuka Purani and I were there, and he asked us if we wanted to embrace sannyas and this life of renunciation for the sake of realization. And we said, yes, we wanted to do that. And he wrote a beautiful scripture at that time, the Lavananta Gita, which is his call to this radical practice that he described as renunciation and realization by his divine grace. This period of his work lasted from 1986 until 2000. And again, just as suddenly as 1986, there was a moment in April of 2000 at Ruchiradama Hermitage, which was an island off the coast of Seattle, Washington. And in that moment, again, there was this sudden, spontaneous release of his own person. This time, instead of going, a release, even as he described going out, the energies going out his arms in 1986, it was a total release upward in ascension. And it was clear in his body in beholding them that this was occurring. I was initially sitting behind him, and he said to come around to the front to bring him down into the body. And we began to feel that he might not continue with his bodily association because the signs were so extreme. But then the ascension was very dramatic. And then he achieved the most beatific, beautiful look of bhava, of love bliss. His eyes were upturned completely, and there was this total blissfulness in his being, and utter stillness. And at that moment, I couldn't do a thing more of massaging or touching him. I didn't want to disturb him, because it seemed his peace, the samadhi, shouldn't be disturbed. But then, all of a sudden, he again began to reassociate. He began to come down again. And he began to speak to us and call out to his intimates, his daughters and his intimates in the room. And you could feel him coming down and returning again out of his love for his intimates, his children, and for all. And this time, he didn't descend to his toes. He descended, as he said, to his brows and not below. There was no sorrow. There was just this brightness, just this utter, absolute luminous brightness. And he began, even as weak as he was, he began to sit in darshan constantly. And sitting with him was absolutely extraordinary then, because he would just radiate this, as you see in this image from Ruchiradama. He would just sit in this bhava, and the most luminous light would just pour out of his hands. I remember sitting with him and feeling it just streaming from his fingers and his face. And he'd look at you with his eyes, and this was like being lightning streaks would come from his eyes into your heart. It was this profound transmission of his brightness. And that then became the nature of his work from 2000. It was an utterly different process again. It was one of beholding him in his spiritual brightness. This process continued to occur and has continued in the last 8 years since 2000, and magnified. And part of that process, the magnification of this brightness, was also the outshining even of his own bodily form. And you see, we didn't really know it altogether, even though he was stating it. But what's really occurring was the fulfilling, the accomplishment of his divine avataric work here. He described in 2008 an extraordinary fact. To him, it was a fact. He said, "I've accomplished the establishment of the full pattern of egoless existence for all beings, for all time." He suddenly, based on that, finalized his spiritual dharma, his theatrical literature, his written instructions on world peace. And he was incredibly passionately involved in his art. And he was working nonstop in his picture-perfect art studio. And he said, you see, even that, all the images that he was making with his art, he said, these were all self-portraits of reality itself, in which I'm creating transcendental realism in the purest sense. The images he was making in his art studio were like flowing from him like from a waterfall. He was acting with such passion, such urgency, and they were so beautiful to him. And in the midst of this, he would sit in darshan. This was a beautiful image here at Samraj Mahal, in which we had worshipped him, doing puja on his beautiful body. And he was showing the sign of utter translucency in his divine body. And this was really what he was doing, this and working in Picture Perfect with his art. That was, he was living a more and more simple life, more and more indifferent to everything, just this translucent transmission of brightness. And this work on these divine images, which are, as Jonathan said, agents, forms of his transmission. Suddenly, in Picture Perfect, on November 27th, he was in the midst of this work with his images. And again, he entered into a yogic swoon, in which he took his Mahasamadhi. He leaned forward, he leaned to the left. I ran to catch him and lifted him to the floor. And by the time his head was being placed on a pillow there, his eyes had taken an infinite gaze, and it was clear that he had left his divine body and taken Mahasamadhi. But instantly he revealed his eternal presence. He revealed that he was still there. It was a shock. No one expected it. But it was a process that each and every one was taken through by his absolute love and grace, where to each one of us at heart, he revealed this secret of his still being here with us, with each one, not just in his eternal, undifferentiated form of light, but most intimately, most directly at heart. And even with all of the qualities that we've known him in his bodily human form, his love, his humor, his beauty, his power, his gentleness, his suddenness, he wrote this years before. He said, look for my revelation. He said, do you see the way I am? My manner, my disposition, my humor, my sometimes sympathetic quickness, my disposition to intervene, my gentleness, my hardness, my power foot, my beauty foot, all these divine qualities. These are the qualities of my omnipresence also, my eternal presence. I am exhibiting my eternal personality to you through showing it in some basic terms in your likeness through a human form. In those days, after the passing of this bodily human form, this same personality will be experienced by you. Devotees will find me out. All will find me out, remarkably, that I am the very divine person, the eternal person. always present for all, in all time. Da. We thank you, beloved Guru, for your eternal love. Da. Da. Da.